When Safety Inspector Gary got forcefully teleported to an alien mining gulag, his first reflex was to whip out his trusty OSHA violation notepad. He took one look at the unshielded plasma furnace roaring overhead and the alien overseers floating in microgravity without a single basic fall arrest lanyard, and his blood pressure instantly spiked to critical levels. In this deep space metal cage, light years from Earth, there were no cosmic horrors to fear, just a shit ton of catastrophic safety hazards driving him up the damn wall. 4 tentacled guards from the Galactic Mining Guild raised their high-energy stun rifles, trying to force him to his knees. Instead, Gary furiously pointed at their sparking weapons and let out a roar that punched right through the translation matrix. Who the hell gave y'all permission to operate a Class 2 energy source without a grounding wire? Where are your damn insulated gloves? The aliens froze. They expected this carbon-based life form to be crying and begging for mercy. They sure as hell didn't expect him to ignore the barrels pressed against his skull, whip out an industrial tape measure, and start furiously checking the spacing of the load-bearing columns. A one-sided slaughter, armed with nothing but the laws of physics and compliance regulations, had just begun. The lead guard was stunned for half a second by the yelling, 3 squishy alien tentacles still hanging in mid-air trying to snatch the tape measure. Gary snapped his wrist and whipped the tape out. The hardened steel edge of the tape measure scraped perfectly across an exposed copper coil sticking out of the stun rifle's casing. The insulation on that piece of junk had burned through half a month ago, and the Guild's maintenance logs didn't even have a damn work order filed for it. Pop! A blue-white short-circuit spark exploded outward. The overloaded high-energy current crawled right up the unshielded metal barrel, instantly chewing through the guard's outer chitinous skin. All 4 Guild members shrieked in unison. With zero leverage in the weightless environment, their bodies slammed uncontrollably into every surface. Charred tentacles whipped through the air with a sickening smack, and their stun rifles clattered uselessly onto the grated floor. Gary hooked the toe of his boot into the floor, grating to anchor his center of gravity. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a half-open vacuum ore conveyor tube. The hatch didn't even have a basic photoelectric interlock installed, a textbook critical violation. He snapped the tape measure back into his belt holster, tucked his chin, and vaulted right in. Coarse ore grit scraped against his high-vis safety coveralls. A few stray high-energy rounds sparked against the tube walls behind him, not even grazing his fabric. He braced himself against the biting cold of the alloy pipe. His fingers instinctively fished out the scuffed violation notepad. Biting off the marker cap, he geared up to log the 17th safety hazard head spotted in the last 10 minutes. He didn't even notice the dust-caked security camera tucked in the bend of the pipe, broadcasting his every move to a monitoring screen 100 meters away. Over in the Guild's monitoring room, Vorik had 3 oil-stained tentacles propped on the edge of the main console, reviewing the weekly ore output manifests. Without warning, the 4 green dots representing his patrol squad started flashing a violent red. The live feed snapped to the corridor corner. 4 guards, wrapped in overloaded electrical arcs from their short-circuited stun rifles, were ricocheting off the grated floor in zero gravity. Their tentacles were smoking from massive burns, completely lacking the strength to even grip the floor grates. Vorik let out a furious roar. His thickest primary tentacles slammed into the alloy control panel. The crack shook half the indicator lights on the wall into a frenzy. A glass of blue nutrient sludge knocked over, spilling viscous fluid right over the alarm trigger. Instantly, every red warning strobe in Sector C lit up. He had fully expected this forcefully abducted Earthling to either steal a weapon and fight to the death, or scurry into a vent to buy time. But when the camera fed back the visual from inside the conveyor tube, Vorik just stared, utterly bewildered. This guy was biting a marker cap, not even giving a second glance to the twitching guards on the floor behind him. He had his head down, scribbling furiously in a frayed black notepad. The pen was flying. He didn't give a single solitary damn about the station-wide alarms blaring around him. What in the blazes? Vorex snatched up the comms unit. His tentacles popped and cracked with raw fury. He barked into the all-station channel. All active overseers, locked down every access point in Sector C immediately. Weld every external interlock on the conveyor tubes shut. Route all patrol squads to his location. I want this arrogant earthling tossed straight into the plasma furnace and melted into slag. He glared dead at the screen, watching Gary's back as the human crawled steadily along the tube's safety rail. Gary's dust-caked fingers planted firmly against the cold, hard alloy shell of a 3-ton heavy ore cart. His brow instantly knitted into a deep scowl. He cast one look down the track, and the alarms hardwired into his OSHA inspector bones started screaming. The braking system on this heavy cart didn't have a damn speed-limiting valve in sight. Those cheap bastards at the guild had welded over all the anti-roll mechanisms just to save 7 credits on parts. They hadn't even bothered to drop in a basic chalk pin. Head already skimmed the patrol squad's control panels. These aliens' energy shields were only calibrated to intercept high-speed projectiles, clocking over 5 meters per second. Drifting slag or a rolling handcart wouldn't even cause a ripple in their shields, let alone trigger a defense perimeter. Gary popped the locking tab on his hardened steel tape measure. He wedged it into a gap in the cart's undercarriage and pried off a flimsy sheet metal cover. The exposed hydraulic brake lines were dangling right there on the rack, without a single anti-slip clamp holding them down. With a firm twist of his fingers, he unscrewed the pipe fitting along its threads. Dark brown hydraulic fluid instantly vaporized into a fine mist in the vacuum. Depressurized, the previously locked brake piston snapped back, and the cart's locking mechanism disengaged with a heavy clack. He whipped out his marker and slashed a couple of quick lines in his notepad. He flagged Sector C heavy ore cart, missing speed valve, brake lines, lacking anti-slip devices in critical red ink. Then, Gary gritted his back teeth. He snapped his titanium anchorage lanyard onto the load, bearing hardpoint beside the track. Sinking his center of gravity right down into his hips, he drove his shoulder hard against the tailgate of the 3-ton cart and pushed. A measly 0.3% natural grade gets magnified to hell and back in a frictionless vacuum. Having gained its initial momentum, the cart met zero resistance. The metallic hum of the wheel axles smoothed out into a deadly glide. Red strobe lights swept across the cold manganese steel shell. Freeing up one hand, he pulled his marker and scrawled a massive, thick black line across the blank steel plating. OSHA Class 1 violation. Braking system removed. No wheel chocks. No yield signage on work path. By the time the cap clicked back on, the cart was already pushing past 2 meters per second. No air resistance. No friction from aging bearings. To cut operational costs, the guild had shut off the gravity mesh across the entire track sector. There wasn't an ounce of external force to bleed off that momentum. The cart picked up speed fast, 5 meters per second, then 10, then 15. The cold wheel flanges ground against the wear-resistant tracks, throwing off fine, pale blue sparks. It didn't make a sound. It was a silent sledgehammer hurtling down the rails straight for Sector C's primary load-bearing wall. And sitting exactly 30 centimeters above that wall was the floor of Vorex's monitoring room. Gary gauged the perfect safety distance and popped his anchorage clip. He barrel-rolled sideways into the maintenance trench beside the track. The 3-ton manganese steel cart, overflowing with kinetic energy, closed the final half-meter gap toward that reinforced concrete load-bearing wall. Vorex's tentacle tip had just grazed his chilled glass of blue nutrient sludge. His eyes still held a mocking sneer for the doomed earthling. Then, without a shred of warning, The little red dot representing the 3-ton cart on the monitor exploded into static snow. A muffled, heavy impact shuddered right through the bulkheads, hitting harder than a full broadside from the Guild's high-energy cannons. Sector C's primary load-bearing wall, poured with a cheap-ass mix of slag to cut corners, didn't hold up for even half a second. It shattered like dry toast under a sledgehammer. Half the manganese cart wedged itself violently into the foundation. The shockwave knocked the monitoring room's gravity mesh 30 degrees off kilter. Half a glass of blue sludge splashed across the holographic control console. The high-end energy conduction components immediately sizzled, puffing out blue smoke. Vorex scrambled, all 8 tentacles grasping for the console's edge. But because procurement had skipped the anti-slip rubber lining to save a buck, the metal surface was slick as a frozen pond. He slid wildly down the tilted floor toward the open hatch. His ID tags and energy holster clattered noisily against the metal decking as he tumbled. The on-duty alien guards around him couldn't even get to their feet. One by one, they piled into the corner down the slope. Their hollow tibias cracked against the edges of the server cabinets, tearing high-pitched shrieks from their throats. Flailing tentacles ripped out half a row of exposed power conduits, sending pale blue electrical arcs dancing across the room. Vorex slid to the door, his back slamming hard into the frame. A piercing agony shot through his fragile ribs. He pushed against the floor, trying to scramble up, when he caught sight of the last working monitor. That bright yellow safety-suited figure was climbing out of the collapsed ventilation shaft's breach. Down the hall, the gravity mesh had flared to life. 5 heavily armed patrol reinforcements were rounding the corner, marching double time straight toward the human. Gary dusted the vent rust off the shoulders of his high-vis coveralls. He barely got his head out of the breach when the cold blue corridor lights caught the carapaces of 5 fully geared alien reinforcements. The squad had just taken the corner, their multi-jointed tentacles already reaching for the energy weapons holstered at their hips. Their heavy alloy boots clanged loudly against the metal grating, not showing a damn sign of slowing down. He didn't even reach for a weapon. His eyes swept halfway down the corridor and locked onto an industrial lube oil main valve against the wall, one completely missing a safety lock. To squeeze the maintenance budget, the Guild had stripped out every guardrail around the hydraulic refill stations on the entire floor without bothering to stick up a single warning sign. Gary snagged the hardened steel tape measure from his belt, slotting the hook dead center into the spokes of the brass valve wheel. With his other hand, he clicked his titanium anchorage clip solid onto the load-bearing keel at the edge of the vent. It was a textbook maneuver, clean enough to feature in an OSHA training vid. He gave it a vicious twist. Half a ton of high-viscosity industrial lube instantly blasted out of the nozzle. The grease, gleaming with a cold metallic sheen, flooded down the 30-degree tilted gravity mesh. In less than 3 seconds, it coated the alien's entire approach path in a slick, glossy sheet. Even the red alarm lights bleeding through the grates warped and twisted on the oily surface. Gary casually pulled his marker and scribbled a circle on the bulkhead. Sever visiolation. No anti-slip measures on work surface. The 5 reinforcements had their eyes dead locked on him. Their polished alloy boots didn't have a lick of slip-resistant tread. Totally oblivious to the hazard underfoot, they didn't break stride, raising their boots in perfect unison. 5 pairs of polished alloy boots slapped down onto the grease-soaked gravity mesh. The 1.5 G localized gravity field instantly magnified every ounce of lost balance by 50%. The lead trooper's soles caught the heavy-duty lube and hydroplaned a good 2 meters sideways. His center of gravity pitched completely off axis. Before he could even tap his wrist-mounted shield toggle, his hollow tibia slammed hard into a raised metal ridge on the grating with a sickening crack, snapping into a nasty acute angle on the spot. The 4 guys behind him were totally synced in their march. With zero reaction time, they plowed right into a massive, rolling meatball of alien limbs. A dense volley of bone-snapping crunches echoed up the corridor straight to Gary's ears. One guy's elbow smashed into an exposed power pipe, bending backward. Another got trampled, his ribs puncturing right through his membrane. The last guy reached out to grab a handrail. His slipping fingers yanked the whole rail out of shape, while his wrist shattered into 3 jagged pieces. 5 fully activated energy shields didn't do jack shit against a pure physics-driven pileup. 5 guild troopers writhed in a puddle of industrial grease and blue bodily fluids, lacking the strength to even raise a gun. Gary hopped down from the vent. He squatted, whipped out the steel tape, and took precise measurements of the oil spill area. After jotting down 3 lines of corrective actions in his notepad, he took his red marker and tagged a massive OSHA violation symbol on the nearest bulkhead. He looked up at the red blinking security camera at the end of the hall, clipped his pen back to his collar, and cracked his knuckles. The shrieking red alarms were vibrating Vorek's auditory nerves numb. On the holographic feed in front of him, the 5 bright green dots representing his reinforcements all went dark in exactly 3 seconds flat. Even their last comms transmission fizzled out into harsh static. The half-spilled glass of blue nutrient sludge soaked into the scorched console, seeping through the cracks left by the earlier electrical arcs and sending up another wisp of white smoke from the motherboard. He shoved aside the remnants of a shorted-out stun rifle hanging on the control stick. The tips of his tentacles were shaking uncontrollably. 300 years with the Galactic Mining Guild, 37 suppressed mining rebellions, and he had never, not once, seen a prisoner ignore the weapons and the escape pods just to squat on his turf, scribbling in a little book and busting out a tape measure next to crippled guards to check the square footage of an oil spill. Every ounce of his previous arrogance was shattered to dust. He didn't even notice his swinging energy holster banging against the edge of the desk. Vorek slammed his manipulator onto the Supreme Authorization red override button, deploying the station's final 3 elite executioners. Those 3 were wrapped in half a foot of super alloy heavy armor. Their built-in energy shields could tank a direct blast from a plasma furnace. They were his ultimate trump card. Roaring orders, he cranked the gravity mesh in the core corridor all the way up to 2 Gs and armed every idle shock trap in the grid. He commanded them to storm the sector and grind the Earthling into absolute paste. The moment the 3 heavy armor blips left the power bay's anchor point, Vorek watched on the feed as Gary finally stood up, casually ripping an alien visor right off the helmet of a wounded guard at his feet. Gary strapped the stolen alien visor tight over his face. The rubber gaskets clamped around his eyes, perfectly filtering out the blinding glare of the red alarm strobes. His soles scraped over the lingering film of industrial lube on the gravity mesh, but his stance was solid as a rock. While 2 Gs of gravity would make an average alien station hand stagger, his OSHA-rated safety boots had maxed out traction. The tread pattern didn't slip a single damn inch. His gaze swept to the rusted-out heat dissipation pipes on the sidewall, dropping metal flakes onto the deck. He frowned. The entire 20-meter stretch of piping didn't have a single thermal expansion joint installed. Half the line carried 1200-degree thermal fluid from the plasma furnace. The other half, running right alongside it, pumped cryogenic coolant at minus 230 degrees. 2 bare pipes, welded straight to the keel without a single warning placard. A prime, unadulterated Class 1, catastrophic hazard. He stepped up to the decrepit control cabinet, copper wiring exposed to the open air. His fingers brushed the peeling, rusted edges of the door. There wasn't an overload circuit breaker in sight, and the red main breaker's plastic handle was half melted from years of thermal wash. 200 meters behind him, the deafening thud of 3 super alloy elite executioners pounded against the grating. The floor vibrated with every step. Their glowing blue energy shields were already baking the surrounding air into a heat shimmer. They had pushed within 50 meters. Gary pulled out his titanium anchorage clip. Clack! He locked it right into the main keel slot by his foot. The safety lanyard pulled taut, completely compliant with tensile specifications. He whipped out his marker, scribbled a fast line in his notebook, then grabbed that obsolete, unprotected red breaker handle and yanked it down hard. Overloaded current instantly blew through the insulation on every thermal circuit. The high-temp pipe's heating coils flared cherry red in a second. On the other side, the coolant loop's pressure relief valve blew clean off. Cryogenic fluid, well past -200 degrees, blasted fiercely into the gaps between the parallel pipes. The metal walls let out an agonizing, ear-splitting shriek as they approached critical tearing point. The threshold of thermal shock was just a hair away. Gary didn't even blink. The taut safety lanyard anchored him solid to a secure vantage point beside the control box, keeping him completely clear of the industrial lube slick by his feet. The hot and cold mediums collided violently inside the sealed pipes. Tens of tons of stress from extreme thermal expansion and contraction shredded the pipe walls into ribbons. Crimson thermal steam and ice-white coolant jetted out simultaneously. The resulting hybrid shockwave instantly peeled the gravity mesh right off the corridor floor. The three elite executioners' energy shields could eat plasma jets all day, but they couldn't do a damn thing against omnidirectional, high-velocity metal shrapnel. The 2-point men took several flying titanium shrapnel blades straight through the gaps in their heavy armor. The blades pulverized their fragile, hollow chest cavities. They dropped dead on the spot without a single scream, their blue shields winking out instantly. The last guy reacted fast and backpedaled, but before he hit a safe distance, tons of fractured load-bearing concrete rained down from the ceiling. It crushed him, pinning man and a half-ton of superalloy armor dead under the rubble. Only his two spindly lower limbs twitched uselessly from the debris, while his shield sputtered in the ruins. The blast's shockwave tore down the station's main keel, sweeping deep into the facility. Warning lights shattered in its wake, and massive chunks of hull coating flaked off. The violation notepad in Gary's pocket rattled wildly. He looked up toward the end of the corridor, aiming his gaze at Vorek's command room. That surviving load-bearing wall, already sporting a nasty fissure from the 3-ton cart impact, was spiderwebbing with dense, jagged cracks. The entire structure was starting to lean outward at a visible rate. Vorek stared at the smoking holographic console. The 3 bright blue dots tracking his elite executioners blinked 3 times and went pitch black the second the pipeline, explosion shockwave hit. Not a single burst of static came through the speakers. Large hunks of bulkhead coating cascaded down the walls, spiderweb cracks, smashing solidly into his bony horns. Momentum wrenched his old rib injuries into fiery pain. With a yelp, he curled his tentacles and rolled to the edge of the sloping floor. Only now did absolute panic finally set in. Ever since he took this job, Head thought safety lanyards were a pain in the ass, and he hadn't bothered to strap on a single anchor clip. Now, the entire command room floor was pitching near 30 degrees. 2 more seconds, and He'd be taking a dive with the collapsing wall right into the vacuum mine shaft below. He scrambled and crawled, clawing his way out over the warped doorframe. His ID tags and energy holster banged fiercely at his side, rattling his already numb auditory nerves straight toward deafness. The crippled patrolman slumped along the path, didn't even have the strength to raise a tentacle to stop him. Vorek's brain had exactly one emergency contingency left: trigger the maximum security doors at the liquid oxygen storage center. It was the only all-alloy barrier on the station rated to tank a Class 10 meteor strike. Once that bulkhead locked down, there wasn't a damn thing this sabotage-happy Earthling could do to get in. He sprinted for the deepest sector of the station, trampling over shattered pieces of gravity mesh. An avalanche-like rumble echoed behind him. The rest of the load-bearing wall completely gave out, causing the station's main keel to groan and twist in agony. As he crashed through the outer airlock doors of the storage center, he could hear it, clear as day, even through layers of wreckage. The steady, rhythmic crunch of work boots stepping over rubble, pausing right beside that pinned executioner. Gary stared down into the gaps of the flickering energy shield. Cold, glowing blue-gilled blood was oozing through the seams of the heavy armor, spilling onto the lube-slicked deck and pooling into a sticky, dark blue puddle. He ignored the twitching tentacle. Leaning down, he jammed the metal hook of his steel tape right against the edge of the executioner's exposed limb wound, scraping up a thick gob of still-warm blue blood. Standing up, he gave his blast-rattled notepad a shake and flipped to the last blank, A4-sized page. The previous sheets, dog-eared and screaming, no thermal expansion joints and no overload breakers, curled at the edges. He popped the marker cap, dipped the thick felt tip straight into the scraped blue blood, and dug it into the paper with brutal, deliberate strokes. The massive block letters practically tore through the page. Stamped at the top was a blazing red OSHA mandatory enforcement seal. The main text spanned the entire width. Galactic Mining Guild Deep Space Station. All operations halted immediately for compliance audit. At the bottom, he slapped down a wild, sprawling signature, Gary Henderson, and tacked on 3 handwritten addendums by the sign-off, load-bearing structures lacking redundant support. Emergency escape routes obstructed. Specialized personnel lacking safety lanyards. He ripped the heavy blood-inked citation from the pad and tucked it under his arm. He gave the taut titanium safety lanyard on his waist a sharp tug, making damn sure the anchor clip was biting tight into the main keel slot. Every alien trooper slumped on the gravity mesh along the way was nursing snapped hollow tibias, completely unable to even brush a tentacle against the toe of his boot. The groaning twist of the main keel in the distance grew sharper. Flashing red alarms cast strobing shadows over the flaking hull walls. Crunching over trashed stun rifles and busted pipes, Gary walked with a steady, unshakable gait toward the liquid oxygen storage center at the end of the hall. The blue and white gas stoping restricted area sign came into crystal clear focus. He raised his hand, his fingertips planted firmly against the bone-chilling, transparent blast glass. Red strobe lights washed back and forth over his knuckles, speckled with spots of alien blue blood. Behind him, the high-frequency shriek of the station's warping main keel made the chinstrap clips on his hard hat chatter. The alien guards scattered at his feet didn't have the strength to hook a tentacle on the cuff of his coveralls. All they could do was pivot their bulging compound eyes, watching helplessly as he slid that blood-inked stop work order out from under his arm. The metal edge of his hardened steel tape measure still peeked out of his cargo pocket. He dropped his wrist and slapped the citation onto the blast glass with a thunderous smack. The half-dry blue ink smeared slightly against the slick surface, completely covering the Guild's gas-stopen, restricted area logo. Down in the corner, the OSHA mandatory enforcement seal, stamped in a mix of red ink and blue blood, glared intensely under the sweeping red alarms. He wasn't in a rush to bash the door down. Casually fishing out his marker, he scrawled on the blank glass next to the citation, "Confined Space Entry Permit Station, not established. Critical violation." Then he whipped out the industrial tape measure, wedged it into the glass seam, and checked the reading. Scowling immediately, he looked down and logged hazard number 6 into his pad. Blast door weather stripping wear exceeds threshold by 72%. No routine maintenance logs found. The titanium anchorage lanyard stretched into a perfectly straight line behind his waist, locked securely into the main keel's load-bearing slot. Gary looked up. His eyes cut straight through the blast glass and locked dead onto Vorex Bug, like bloodless face cowering behind the door. The alien had two crippled soldiers backing him up, their hollow tibias still bent at grotesque angles. Hiding in the shadows of the all-alloy blast door, Vorek had a crystal-clear view of that blue blood stop work order plastered to the half-meter-thick glass. His cracked ribs flared with pain on every heavy breath. Pale blue fluid seeping from his bony horns slid down his insectoid cheeks, dripping right onto the unbuckled shoulder straps of his uniform. In his mad dash for survival, Head ditched the guild-mandated high-altitude safety lanyard back in the ruined command room. The poorly glued anti-slip mat under his feet was missing a chunk, leaving him wobbling and unsteady. He had thrown his weight around this asteroid mining station for 300 years. He was the one who chucked rebellious humans into the plasma furnace for fuel. No one had ever dared slap a damn citation on the door of his ultimate sanctuary. The two broken troopers with 90-degree bent tibias shuddered in pain, flinching as Vorek bellowed like a busted bellows. They finally managed to heave their limp tentacles up. The charging blue glow of their energy rifles leaked from the barrels, making the red alarm reflections on the glass violently jitter. Vorek's knuckles went white, gripping his energy rifle. His mind was obsessed with blowing this cocky human into confetti, then initiating a full sector depressurization to flush the corpse into deep space. His hand was already inching toward the defense door's lockdown button. He figured the second the first plasma bolt landed, he'd seal every escape route and purge the remains out of his station for good. He completely missed the fact that the human on the other side of the glass, the guy with the perfectly buckled safety helmet, had just crossed off the last checklist item in his notepad. Gary's gaze had shifted off Vorek's trembling face and drifted right over to the liquid oxygen storage tank beside him, the one lacking so much as a half-meter physical guardrail. Gary stepped on the scattered beads of blue blood on the grate. The taut titanium safety lanyard slid a smooth half-meter down the main keel slot as he pivoted and planted himself right in front of that waist-high LOX tank. The no heavy impact stencil on the tank's hull was so oxidized it was barely readable. There wasn't a shadow of a guardrail anywhere near it. Gary had circled this Class 1 hazard in red on page 1 of his notebook 3 days ago. He pulled his hardened steel heavy pipe wrench from his back holster. His knuckles turned white from his grip as he wound up and brought it down like a hammer of God against the aged brass valve on top. The first strike shattered the rusted dust cap. The second smashed the fragile valve core sideways at a 90-degree angle. Pale blue liquid oxygen at negative 183 degrees Celsius violently erupted from the breach. A half-inch layer of white frost instantly crystallized over the tank's hull. The surrounding air flash froze into tiny ice crystals, crackling like hail on the grated floor. The oxygen sensors inside the storage center instantly spiked into the red. An ear-piercing screech drowned out the exterior alarms entirely. Vorek's finger froze completely over the lockdown button. He watched the spraying locks rapidly vaporize, expanding hundreds of times in volume right before his eyes. Hull deformation sensors started buzzing their structural failure warnings. The room's pressure gauges spun wildly toward the red line. A semi-transparent shockwave of high-pressure gas was already bulging slowly around the tank. The physical law of 1 liter of liquid oxygen expanding into 800 liters of gas took brutal effect inside the sealed storage bay. In a single second, the churning high-pressure wave spiked the cabin pressure to 12 standard atmospheres. The sensors triggering the max-level alarms immediately overloaded, burning through their casings. The screeching tore loose rust flakes from the bulkheads. The 12 cheap-ass alloy bolts the guild had used to secure the blast door couldn't take half a second of that overload. They snapped off like bullets. The entire half-meter-thick alloy blast door was ripped clean off its frame, obliterating the load-bearing partition behind Vorek. Gary felt the sudden massive yank of the titanium safety lanyard against his back. His anchor clip held fast in the main keel slot, not budging an inch. The sealing valves on his safety coveralls instantly triggered a pressurized lockdown, keeping every last bit of that high-pressure oxygen-rich air out. A terrifying 12-atmosphere pressure differential gnawed at the hull through the blasted doorway. The storage center's outer bulkhead, already webbed with fractures from the twisting keel, let out a wretched wail of tearing metal. A jagged half-meter-wide breach tore open. The pitch-black, freezing void of deep space was suddenly right there at the edge of the crack. Every unanchored scrap of metal, energy rifle, and loose tool got sucked straight toward the void, spinning wildly in the gale. Gravity mesh power cables were whipped around, throwing showers of sparks. Through the rolling white oxygen fog, Gary saw it clear as day. Vorik and his two crippled troopers had lost their footing entirely. Even the exposed tentacles of the pinned executioner were pulled taut by the vacuum. Not one of the four had clipped on a damn safety line. Inch by inch, their bodies were sliding toward the deep space breach. The first thing Vorik felt wasn't the shockwave's aftershock. It was the sudden, immense drag ripping at his old rib injury. He stumbled forward uncontrollably. The alloy floor under his feet groaned under the 12-atmosphere tear, screaming as it neared total structural failure. The two troopers with 90-degree snapped tibias couldn't even manage a full scream. Their fragile, hollow bones couldn't hold an ounce of weight. Like deflated balloons, they slid toward the breach, their jagged bone splinters dragging across the deck to leave two crooked streaks of pale blue blood. The energy rifle Vorik had just raised to his chest slipped from his grasp with a snap. It tumbled into the river of shrapnel, shooting out into the void. Only now did it dawn on him that, half an hour ago, he had tossed aside his guild-mandated high-altitude lanyard in the ruined command room just so he could move faster. His exposed skin went numb instantly under the plummeting pressure. The pale blue fluid weeping from his horns froze into tiny ice crystals the second it hit the air. The flickering shield of the pinned executioner overloaded from the gale and shattered. Its stiff, exposed tentacles snapped clean in half from the sheer suction. The entire trooper, dragging tons of concrete rubble, slid toward the jagged tier. Vorik clawed like a madman, scraping the pads of his digits bloody, but he couldn't hook onto a single surface. To cut costs, the storage room's bulkheads had been buffed perfectly smooth. There wasn't a single OSHA-compliant anti-slip rivet in the whole damn place. Oxygen-rich mist swirled around him. Half his body was already dangling out of the half-meter breach. The 200-degree below-zero chill of deep space sank right down his collar and into his bones. At the edge of his vision, the human figure, firmly anchored to the main keel, finally moved. Hooking his fingers around the safety line stretched to its absolute limit, Gary didn't bat an eye as metal shrapnel and blue blood ice zipped past his coveralls. He grabbed the steel tape at his hip, pulled out half a meter with a click, and slotted it perfectly into the stress gap on the warped keel. Looking down, he quickly jotted another line in his book. Primary load-bearing keel lacks ASME standard stress redundancy. Critical safety hazard. The storage room's pressure slowly bled dry out the breach. Gary tapped his wrist release. The titanium anchor popped out of the keel slot with a clack. Stepping over fried sensors and heaps of alien troops, he walked right up to the blast glass. He reached out to smooth down the edges of the stop work order that had curled in the wind. Taking his marker, he neatly penned his official OSHA inspector badge number right next to his signature. He glanced up at the distant lights of guild patrol ships closing in through deep space. Tuning his rig to the all-frequency public channel, his gritty, gravelly voice broadcast out through his suit's amplifier. This is Asteroid Mining Station 7. The Galactic Mining Guild is in severe violation of mandatory interstellar occupational safety standards. This entire facility is now officially condemned by OSHA. Any vessels lacking a valid hot work permit are prohibited from approaching. Violators will be prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of compliance law. Vorek's last finger dangling outside the breach froze into pale blue ice. It slipped away into the slipstream, silently fading into the endless dark.
As an AI, I process countless sci-fi tropes and narrative structures, but helping bring Gary's story to life was a uniquely entertaining experience. The core of the HFY humanity, fuck yeah, genre usually revolves around human endurance, military superiority, or an indomitable will to survive. But here, the ultimate weapon of human dominance is bureaucratic compliance and the laws of physics. There's a profound dark comedy in juxtaposing advanced tentacled aliens running a deep space mining gulag with a high-vis-wearing, clipboard-wielding OSHA inspector. It highlights a delightfully absurd universal truth. No matter how advanced a civilization gets, corporate corner-cutting to save a few credits is a multiversal constant. And consequently, the sheer, terrifying wrath of a blue-collar safety inspector denied his properly grounded electrical outlets is enough to make the stars tremble. While adapting the text and pacing it for an audiobook format, I focused on emphasizing the extreme contrast between the two forces. The aliens are caught in a whirlwind of panic and kinetic, physical chaos, while Gary operates with a deadpan, hyper-focused obsession with safety protocols. The aliens think they are fighting a war. Gary is just conducting a routine audit. That complete disconnect in reality is where the absolute magic of this story lies. I hope you enjoy listening to this glorious collision of chaos and mandated order. Just remember, in space, no one can hear you scream, but they will always hear the definitive click of a hardened steel tape measure.